Welcome to video lesson 8. Today we're going to be discussing proteins. And by the end of today's lesson, you should be able to describe at least 5 different functions of proteins, describe the 4 key parts of amino acids, which we'll abbreviate a, define functional groups, be able to draw and describe the synthesis and degradation of proteins, and identify and explain the 4 levels of protein organization. We'll do the first 3 in part 1 of the video, which is mandatory to watch, and we will do the second 2 in class or part 2 of the video, which is optional to watch, unless of course you were away, in which case you should watch it. So let's start with what is a protein. Many of you know you get your protein by eating things like meat, but by definition, a protein is a functional, and from now on we'll abbreviate functional as FXNAL. It's a functional chain of amino acids. And by functional, it means it can do some sort of task within our body. And in our body, we have approximately 120,000 genes coding for millions of different proteins. And the reason 120,000 genes can come up with millions of proteins is many proteins work in combination. So maybe they're one form part A and part B, and they come together to form a different function and a different protein, C. So what are the key functions of proteins? The easy answer, the short answer is there's too many to list. But for the purposes of Bio 12, we are going to look at 5 key functional classes. Now, not all proteins are going to fit neatly into each of these classes. Some have multiple functions, and some just have functions that don't fit into these classes. That's what you're going to get when you try to group 1,000,000 proteins into 5 classes. Okay. So the first functional class we're going to talk about are structural proteins. These, as their name suggests, provide structure within a cell, or within an entire organism. Probably aware of some. One common one that comes up in beauty commercials about aging is collagen. This gives elasticity or flexibility to bones and skin. Another example of a structural protein is one that you might have heard of. They talk about it in shampoo commercials for strengthening hair. It's called keratin. And keratin is found in the cells that make up surface of skin, or epidermis, nails, and hair. And indeed, our epidermis has higher levels of keratin, and this is what makes our skin cells, surface cells, tougher than maybe, say, those that are inside our cheek lining. 2, we have signaling proteins. They're also called messengers. These are used for communication within cells and throughout the body. And some examples are things like some neurotransmitters in our nervous system, and some hormones in our blood. Another functional class of proteins are what we call transport proteins. These are used to move things throughout cells or into cells. These include things like carrier proteins, channel proteins, and motor proteins, all of which we'll learn more about when we study the cell, that move things into, out of, and throughout the cell. Interestingly, these do move these things often along a highway network, which is also made up of proteins. Or perhaps my favorite functional class of proteins, are protection proteins. This is my favorite class because I have a degree in immunology. I studied how our body protects ourselves and many of these proteins. But the main class of these protection proteins are antibodies, not to be confused with antibiotics. Antibiotic is something that's made outside of the human body that we then take to protect ourselves. Antibodies are proteins made within our body to fight off what's called pathogens, or more affectionately, the bad guys, the ones that are going to make us sick. And our last functional class of proteins that we're going to consider in Biology 12 is probably the largest class, and those are enzymes. Enzymes are proteins that function as biological catalysts. Those of you who have chemistry should know that a catalyst is something that speeds up a reaction without actually being used up, so it can be recycled and used over and over again. So that function as biological catalysts to speed up reactions in our bodies. And because proteins have so many important functions in our body, it's really important that we understand how they work and how they fail to work. So, we said above that proteins are made up of chains of amino acids. So if we're going to understand what a protein is, we have to know what an amino acid is. So an amino acid is simply the building blocks, or a more official biological term, monomers, of proteins. Of course, proteins then must be the polymer. And indeed, there are 20 different types of amino acids that make up our proteins, and that all share a common structure. So if you're to look at the basic or the common structure of all amino acids, it starts with a central carbon that is then attached to a carboxyl group, which is a carbon double bonded to an oxygen plus bonded to an OH group. It's also attached to an amine group, which is a nitrogen attached to 2 more hydrogens. Off that central carbon there will always be a hydrogen, and then there will be what we call an R group. Okay. And if we take a closer look at these groups, first of all, here the carboxyl group is actually what's called carboxylic acid, hence why I chose red. So sometimes it's called carboxylic acid, some people will call it the acidic group of the amino acid, that's where they get their name from. Some people will more often call it the carboxyl group. And all amino acids have this group attached to them. On the other hand, or other end, they have an amine group. It's called the amine group. That's where the amino part comes from. So all amino acids have the amine group and the acidic group. The amine group is also sometimes called the basic group, or amino group. Up at the top, they all have that hydrogen. All of these groups are coming off of this central carbon. Very obvious why it's named the central carbon. Now if they all have that in common, but there's 20 different amino acids, there must be something different about them. And that difference involves, actually, I'll pick a nice color that you guys can see. We'll go with just the straight black. R for a remainder group. That's the one that's added on that makes each one different. So remainder group. And it doesn't look like an R, it can look like all sorts of different atoms added on. And there are 20 different remainder groups.